Male. Welcome back to Nuer Language School. Last time we covered 50 words, numbers, colors, family, food. Today we are doing 50 more, the days of the week, animals, the home, and some word you will need to ask question in Nuer. Well, let's jump in. Let's begin with how to say 11. How to say 11. Welkel. 11. Welkel. How to say 11. Welkel. How to say 12. Welrow. 12. Welrow. How to say 13. Weldiok. 13. Weldiok. How to say 14. Welngwan. 14. Welngwan. How to say 15. Weldiage. 15. Weldiage. How to say 16. Welbuckle. 16. Welbuckle. How to say 17. Welbarrow. 17. Welbarrow. How to say 18. Welbadak. 18. Welbadak. How to say 19. Welbangwan. 19. Welbangwan. How to say 20. Genrow. 20. Genrow. Section 2. Professions. How to say teacher. Ngich. How to say teacher. Teacher mean ngich. How to say doctor. Doctor. Kim. Kim. How to say nurse. Ngos nas. Ngos nas. How to say it engineer. Engineer. Kur. Kur. Engineer. Kur. How to say driver. Driver. Ger. Ger. How to say farmer. Farmer is purkani. Purkagni. How to say merchant. Merchant mean gut. Gut. How to say police. Police. Police, or you can just call it police. Same thing. Police. That is, the correct one is police, not police. 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 How to say police? It is police, or gang. You can call it gang. Section 3. Places around town. How to say school? School. Dwelgora. School. Dwelgora. How to say hospital? Hospital. Dwelwal. Dwelwal. Hospital. Dwelwal. How to say market? How to say market? Gwat kuka kwakni. Gwat kuka kwakni. How to say market? Gwat kuka kwakni. How to say church? Church. Dwelkwat. How to say church? Dwelkwat. How to say bank? Bank. Dweltawa yoni. How to say bank? Dweltawa yoni. How to say hotel? Hotel. Gwat kwani. Kia gwat kwang. Hotel. Gwat kwani, or gwat kwan. How to say airport? Airport. Gwat riai niali, or tiaria niali. Airport. Gwaria niali. How to say restaurant? Restaurant is gwat miet kwan. Gwat miet kwan. Gwat and chamko quentin. How to say restaurant? Gwat miet kwan. Restaurant. Section 5. Section 5. Wait, let's begin here. Section 5. Face. Miam. That is, we are learning about body and health. Face. Miam. air, mem. How to say nose, womb. How to say toes, lech. How to say toes, lech. How to say it, neck, mwek. How to say back, jok, back. How to say stomach, jich, How to say stomach, jich. How to say skin, guap, skin, guap. Section 5, times word. How to say hour, tak, tak. How to say minute, minute ni. How to say minute, minute ni. How to say morning, runwang. How to say morning, runwang. How to say evening, tiang, tiang. How to say night, where. How to say night, where. How to say yesterday, pan. How to say yesterday, pan. How to say tomorrow, irun. How to say tomorrow, irun. Tomorrow mean irun. Let's come here. Section 6. Section 6, fruits and vegetables. How to say banana, bele. Banana, bele. How to say mango, manga. Mango, manga. How to say apple, apple. How to say apple, apple. How to say orangey, orangey. How to say orangey? It is orangey or lemon toker. We can call it lemon toker. How to say onion, onion, basole. How to say onion, basol. How to say tomato, tomatum. How to say tomato, tomatum. How to say potato, touch. How to say potato, touch. How to say pepper, mit, or kutet. How to say pepper, mit. How to say it, money, yo. This is section 7, bonus word. Money mean yo. How to say money is yo. Please, if you are new to Nuer Language School, I would like you to help the channel by subscribing, turn on the notification bell. Whenever we upload a new lesson, you can be notified. Thank you for watching, and do not forget to comment.